Hey everybody, how are you? So I want to talk to you guys about the economy. It's arguably the biggest issue we have in politics, and with an election on the way, the economy is more relevant than ever. As such, both parties are trying to get their economic message across, and those messages are quite different. So Republicans are saying, and have been saying, that Joe Biden's economy is an absolute disaster. Democrats have responded by pointing to actual facts, such as the lowest unemployment rate in decades, fastest wage growth in decades, and the highest new manufacturing construction in decades. Moreover, our current GDP growth is faster than any of the other G7 nations with advanced economies, and our inflation is falling faster. The data overall looks pretty good. And yet, recent polling shows that more than half of Americans think we're in a recession. Now, part of that is due to Republicans just lying about it, but that's not the whole answer. In order to understand the situation today, we're going to have to look back at the last 40 to 50 years of economics in the US. They say that if you want to find the truth, follow the money. So what's been happening to the money in America over the last few decades? Follow along and we'll find out. So remember that in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president, and he ushered in the era of trickle-down economics. And trickle-down economics is based on a handful of assumptions, all of which are wrong. Let's take a look at those. Assumption 1. In our capitalist system, people are paid what they're worth. If they get paid more, it's because they generate more for the economy. A CEO is paid however many times more than the janitor because his work is worth that much more to the company and the economy at large. In reality, though, the actual value of your work is only one factor in how much you get paid. Let's take a look at some data. In 1982, Forbes magazine published its first list of the 400 richest Americans. Daniel Ludwig, at the time, was number 1 on the list, and he had a net worth of $2 billion. In 2023, Elon Musk was at the top of the list with $251 million. $1 billion, $251 billion. Even adjusted for inflation, the richest American today is 40 times richer than his counterpart 40 years ago. And Elon isn't the exception, he's the rule. 9 other people on the 2023 list had over $100 billion, with a B, billion dollars. But what about the rest of us? Since 1979, wages for the average American have been essentially flat. Actually, it's worse than that. The data is skewed a little bit because women's wages have gone up significantly, but their salaries only went up because women's wages had been kept down for so long due to a whole bunch of misogyny and discrimination. For men, however, they were making less adjusted for inflation in 2022 than in 1979, despite massive growth in the economy over that same time period. So what happened? Why are wages for regular people falling way behind economic growth, while the wealth of the richest has vastly outpaced it? If we live in a fair system that rewards people based on their work, does that mean that America's workers suddenly become lazy? It's not showing up in the data. In fact, the productivity of the average worker is more than double what it was in 1979. On the other hand, I doubt it's even physically possible for the billionaires of today to be somehow like 40 times smarter or more hardworking than their predecessors. Something else is going on, and there's nothing fair about it. And we're going to find out about that later. So, assumption number 2. Billionaires and CEOs create jobs. We want them to have more money because they will reinvest it into economic growth and new jobs. If we tax them, the growth will slow. The idea behind this is that since these executives want to maximize their income, they'll reinvest any extra profits to grow the business and make even more next year. Unfortunately, this just isn't true. There are many, many other ways for executives to funnel money into their own pockets that require less work and less risk for them while providing the same reward. One of the tricks corporate executives have in their arsenal is something called stock buybacks, where the corporation uses its profits to repurchase shares of their own stock. Until 1982, this was essentially illegal because stock buybacks artificially jack up stock prices. Stocks are supposed to go up in value when the market sees healthy future prospects for a company, which brings in investors from the outside, not because the company's own executives flood the field with money. However, when Ronald Reagan was elected, he named a guy named John Shad, a former Wall Street executive, to lead the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, for the first time since the Great Depression. Shad decided to do a favor for himself and all his Wall Street buddies and created Rule 10b-18 that essentially opened the door for all these buybacks. In the decades since, large companies have been using less and less of their profits on job creation and more funneled directly back into their own pockets. Just among the S&P 500 companies, they're buying back over $1 trillion in stock every year. Between 2008 and 2017, these companies spent 53% of their profits on buybacks and another 30% on dividends, essentially giving the money straight back to shareholders and investors rather than investing it in growth. What investments these corporations do make are financed with debt, not profits. To that point, American corporations went from about $1 trillion in debt when Reagan took office to $14 trillion today. More recently, when Trump's tax cuts flooded corporations with money, only about 20% of that was invested in creating new jobs, and 6% only went to increasing worker salary. 60% went right back to the bosses. America picked up over $8 trillion in debt under Trump's term, due in part to those cuts. So now you and I are going to be paying out to these CEOs for decades to come. And now the assumption 3 of trickle down. Raising taxes and regulations will cause businesses to go elsewhere and lower growth. So this one is just easy to disprove. California and New York have the most billionaires of any state, and out of the 10 largest American companies, 3 are in California, more than any other state. That despite California and New York famously being among the most liberal states in the nation, with some of the highest taxes and regulation. Moreover, historical data in the United States show no particular correlation between lower tax rates for the rich and GDP growth. If anything, there might even be a slightly negative correlation. Now, I realize there are going to be some of you out there who hear what I'm saying right now and agree with me right off the bat. But I know there are others who find this very hard to wrap their heads around. I actually understand these people. My family immigrated to America from the former Soviet Union. Scratch that, they fled here from the former Soviet Union. All my life, I'd grown up hearing horror stories about life under communism, how every aspect of the economy, of life in general, was controlled by the government. A government in which the people had absolutely no say, and which could destroy someone's life for any reason or no reason at all. It was just extremely bad. And the thing about extremes is that people tend to jump from one to the other. That's why when my family came to the US, we found Reagan and the Republican Party so attractive. Not only did they claim all the credit for the collapse of the USSR, even though that was largely caused by long-term internal factors, but they were saying all the right things about how dangerous government can be, especially in economics. And the fact is, there are times when regulation can be destructive. Just look at the housing market in California. And government can also be plenty inefficient. Just look at the Pentagon's audits. I really thought the situation to all problems was less regulation when I was younger. I thought that would solve everything. But looking back on it, I almost want to laugh at myself for just how wrong I was, how simplistic my view of government and economics were. Sure, regulations can cause problems, but deregulation can also cause problems, like the Texas power grid collapsing every time there's a stiff breeze. Likewise, while government can be inefficient, it can also achieve great things like the national highway system. This actually reminds me of a conversation I had a few years ago with a very wise person I met while overseas. This guy, I think his name was Andre, though I can't quite remember, he was one of the more senior medics on my team when I was working as a volunteer paramedic overseas, and he'd lived through quite a bit. Somehow we wound up talking about the concept of self-esteem, and he asked me, what should a person's self-esteem be? Now, I grew up at a time when self-esteem was something we talked about a lot in school, and always they told us the same thing. Everyone needs high self-esteem. The higher, the better. And Andre was expecting me to say that. You know, I've got a feeling he's had this conversation quite a few times with other younger trainees. And he told me that I was wrong. You don't want high self-esteem or low self-esteem. Your self-esteem should be adequate. Not so low that you're depressed all the time, but not so high that you go nuts thinking you're the reincarnation of Jesus. You know, like this guy. Likewise, the more I think about the whole big government versus small government, the more I realize how meaningless that really is. Government should be adequate in size to do the things it needs to do, not so small that it has no effect, and not so large that it becomes wasteful and inefficient. Moreover, Government isn't this one thing that we need to make uniformly bigger or smaller. Maybe some parts need to bulk up while other parts need to slim down. In the USSR, we saw how bad things could get when government regulation goes crazy. In America, though, we've tended to have the opposite problem, with government allowing big business interests to essentially do whatever they wanted to the people. If you look back in our history, modern industrial capitalism, combined with a financial system that we'd find recognizable today, really started to take off in the mid-19th century. From then until roughly the Great Depression, our almost entirely unregulated economy would go through a constant series of booms and busts that left devastation in their wake. A tiny handful of people acquired almost unimaginable wealth, while regular people were left in the lurch. This period was actually called the Gilded Age because you saw these wonderful glowing gold mansions of the wealthy that were hiding the rot and the poverty in the rest of society. So let's take a look at this time. Let's take a look at banks and financial institutions. Unregulated banks frequently made risky loans with depositors' funds, and it was fully possible for you to walk into a bank one day only to have the teller at the window inform you that all your money was gone. That would trigger, and when this would happen, it would trigger a flood of people running back to the bank to try to get their money out, and the bank would collapse, leaving all the depositors utterly screwed. Why has this never happened to any of you listening to me today? Because the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, has been insuring our banking system since the Great Depression. And in return for those benefits, the banks are required to follow certain regulations, like not loaning all of their funds past a certain percentage point. So when the depositors come in, the banks will have the funds waiting for them to cover their withdrawals. And besides the banks, unscrupulous practices in the stock market also helped bring on the Great Depression, which is why we created institutions like the SEC to regulate these entities. And it wasn't just the financial sector that was a real Wild West in the old days, though. With no rules around how companies could treat their workers, most companies treated their workers like disposable garbage. In 1911, in New York City, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory caught on fire. 146 workers, mostly Jewish and Italian immigrants, mostly girls, some as young as 14, died. They died either when their bodies were burned to a crisp, their lungs filled with smoke, or when they splattered against the sidewalk after jumping from the windows. Why didn't they run? Because the owners of the factories had locked them inside in order to prevent unauthorized breaks. And of course, there were no sprinklers or other fire safety measures, since there were no rules in place to require them. Just as there were no rules protecting workers, there were no rules protecting consumers. In the early 1900s, Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle, which was a slightly stylized account of the conditions in the meatpacking industry in the time. While the names and characters Sinclair used were fictional, the actual conditions were bad enough that, after inspectors confirmed what Sinclair reported, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 was passed. How bad was it, you asked? Human thumb in a hot dog level bad. These factories had blood and guts rotting on the floor, so diseased that workers regularly got sick simply from being near it. Put some dye in it so it would look vaguely meat-like, load it up with spices and flavorings, stick a premium meat product on the label, and send it off to the stores. Same thing with medication. There were these so-called patent medicines being sold everywhere, claiming to cure all sorts of ills, from period cramps to cancer, with cutesy names like Miss Betty's Hearty Restorative or something like that, with a label claiming that it had better healing properties than the Holy Grail. What the label rarely had on it, though, was a list of actual ingredients, because in the best case scenario, it was just water. Worst case, it would be loaded with alcohol, opium, cocaine, or all three, and worst case, it might just be straight up poison like arsenic. No way to tell until you drank it and lived, or not. And the problem with all of this, aside from just being completely horrible, is that it happened so long ago that nobody remembers just how awful life was when we didn't have pure food and drug laws, worker safety laws, financial services laws, and all the other tools government now has to keep everything from falling into chaos. The more I think about it, the more obvious it becomes. Somehow, when it comes to economics, many of us, again, myself included at one point, had been convinced that things work better when there are no rules and people just do whatever they want to do. In what other area of life is that true? Even something like a game of football without rules just turns into a brawl. Same thing with the market. When you allow people to make money however the hell they want, a lot of them are going to do it unscrupulously. Just like a football match with no rules winds up with someone filling the ball with lead and putting spikes on helmets, a market with no regulations is just begging for more fraud, corruption, and coercion. If people can make a profit by screwing everyone else, that's what they're going to do. I've actually come to believe that the term unregulated free market is an oxymoron. A market can't truly be free unless it is well regulated. Otherwise, it's just going to be infested with fraud and carved up by cartels and oligopolies. All competition and innovation would be crowded out. The market would become deeply unstable, dominated by booms and busts that prevent long-term investment for growth. Unfortunately, we've forgotten many of these historical lessons. That, combined with the fear of communism, is what has led to this trend over the last 40 years of ever lower taxes and regulation. However, as I start to look more and more closely, I'm starting to think that our current form of radical capitalism is pushing us closer to the problems of the Soviet Union. Let me explain what I mean. The system in the USSR wasn't just communism, rather it was Marxism-Leninism. And Lenin wasn't just a passionate communist, he was a psychopath who had no care for human lives whatsoever. Maybe Lenin didn't quite have that same hunger for blood than Stalin did, but he was the type of guy who could watch 1,000 people shot dead while sipping tea and it wouldn't bother him at all. Lenin was so obsessed with creating his Marxist communist dream that any and all measures became acceptable. Human lives didn't matter. People were just a resource to be used to further the communist cause. People on their own had no worth or value other than what could be provided to the state. Likewise, when I see what's been happening in America over the last 40 to 50 years, I want to call it capitalism-Leninism, or maybe corporatism-Leninism. At the end of the day, both communism and capitalism are just economic systems. Economics comes from the Greek word oikonomikos, which means the proper running of a household. At a time when every family was basically a unit of business in ancient Greece, oikonomia was all about coordinating the labor of a family to provide for their needs. Likewise, today, economics is just the system by which we, as a country, somehow transform the work that we do into the stuff that we need to live. That means that the best economic system is whichever one allows us to live together with the greatest level of prosperity. When you pull the humanity out of economics, when your ideology about how the economy should be ends up creating a system that hurts people and makes their lives worse, that's no longer economics, that's insanity. Here in the US, the obsession with trickle-down Reaganomics/neoliberalism, or whatever you want to call it, has caused us a lot of grief. I gave you guys some data earlier when I wanted you to see the flaws in the assumptions that underlie that system, but now I'm going to give you some more to clarify the situation. In 1965, the average worker would be making about 20 times less than the CEO of their company. By 1989, those workers were making about 60 times less. And by 2021, workers were making 400 times less than their CEOs. That's what happens when you have more than 40 years of absolutely flat or even declining wages for most of us, while executive income just exploded. In 1979, the top 1% of the population made 7.3% of all the wages. In 2021, they made double that at 14.6%. Today, the top 1% has more wealth than the entire middle class, the middle 60% of the population. And that gets more extreme the higher up you go. The 400 people on the Forbes list, just 0.001% of us, by themselves, have about 1.5 times as much wealth as the bottom 170 million Americans. Of the total wealth of those 400, the top 10 hold about a third of it. The richest person on that list, Elon Musk, has some $250 billion to his name. For perspective, the total annual budget of TAMF, Temporary Aid to Needy Families, what they call welfare very often, is just $16.5 billion. Elon could pay that from his pocket change. Remember that the next time someone tells you that welfare is sucking up all the money. That is just not true. Unfortunately, a lot of the discussions around economics have been tinged with racism over the past few decades, with stories of black welfare queens mooching off the system, living like kings on taxpayers' dime while avoiding work, while DI means black people get all the good jobs. All of this is nonsense. Not only are black people not getting any special advantages, they're not even at parity yet. Leave aside that black people on average still earn less than white people, it's even gotten directionally worse in some ways. The average white male worker's salary fell by 3% between 1979 and 2018, while the average black male worker's salary fell by 7% when adjusted for inflation. And believe me, nobody is living like a king on welfare. Less than 1% of Americans receive TANF assistance anyway, most of them children. The average payment per family is about $500 a month, less than half of what the average family pays just for groceries. As to other non-cash assistance programs like Medicaid, only 9% of recipients are not working due to retirement or inability to find work, with the other 91% either working, disabled, or a caregiver for someone disabled. Out of the 9% either unable to find work or retired, let's assume half that number is retirees, leaving us with 4.5% able to work and not working. That's basically the same as the national unemployment level, so these people are working just as much as the rest of us. These people are working, but they just aren't getting paid enough to live, so they need government assistance. And to make it worse still, the reason these workers aren't getting paid enough isn't because the work they do doesn't produce enough economic value to afford the things they need. Worker productivity has increased tremendously over the last few decades while wages have stagnated. Adjusting up for inflation to the value of 2018 dollars, the median prime age full-time worker in 1975 was making $42,000. By 2018, that number was $50,000. It took 43 years for that measly 18 roughly percent of growth, and all of that is accounted for by women's salaries finally catching up to the men. But what would have happened if income distributions between the rich and the working class had stayed at the level they were in 1975? Instead of $50,000, the median worker in 2018 would have been making $92,000. By this year, that would have been $115,000 on average. I took a look recently, and on average, it takes about $100,000 for someone to live comfortably in America today, with some variances per state. Comfortably in this case means 50% of your income for necessities, 30% on wants, and 20% for savings. That's about how we'd be living if things had just stayed as they were in 1975. Instead, we have to make do with barely half of that, just enough to cover necessities. That's why something like 2/3 of us can't even afford a $400 emergency expense. Most of the country is living right on the edge in the way that hasn't been seen in living memory. All the while, the economy has been growing and growing and growing. So where the hell is all the money gone? You've already seen that plenty of it goes to the very wealthiest Americans as individuals, but you should also note that in the same time period between 1975 and 2018, the after-tax profits of American corporations increased by over 2,000%, or 20 times, from about $100 billion to $2 trillion. In the 5 years since then, corporate profits jumped again by over 50% to nearly $3 trillion. And if you're not finding yourself sufficiently pissed off about those last numbers, I want you to think about it a bit more. Remember all that painful inflation we've all had to live through after the COVID pandemic? Well, what is inflation? It's prices going up, right? And what makes up prices? You've got the cost of materials and equipment, you've got labor, and you've got profits. Due to the various supply chain issues caused by COVID and the Ukraine war, some material inputs did become a bit more expensive, but there's not much that can be done about these kind of planet-wide disruptions. Moreover, most of that has reverted to normal. Wages did increase somewhat, certainly faster than at any time in the last few decades, but that only means it's just better than the nothing that we've had during all that time. Wage growth is a well-deserved positive and should be encouraged. And what about corporate profits? Well, after already seeing decades of explosive and record-breaking profits, the years immediately during and after the pandemic have seen the single largest jump in corporate profits ever. $750 billion in about 2 years. The fact is that we've all been feeling the pain simply to pad the pockets of the richest people on the planet. If they just stuck to the world record-breaking profits they'd already had, inflation would have plummeted to the average level a long time ago while still maintaining gains in average wages. What's driving this inflation at the end of the day is pure greed. Greed on a level I genuinely struggle to understand. And as I've come to learn, it's just never, ever, ever enough for these people. One of these days I'm going to do a longer video on Elon Musk. He is the perfect example of this. Here's a guy that started off with tremendous privilege. His dad owned an emerald mine in South Africa. then combine that with an almost limitless ability to convince people who knew nothing about technology that he was some kind of genius. He then used that capital he was able to acquire by basically scamming people, radically overpromising on technology he had neither the knowledge, patience, or even basic scientific ethics to pursue. His ability to BS people has driven Tesla's valuation up some 20 times higher than a company in the same industry with the same sales figures should have. Musk claimed credit for being some kind of technological genius, but as far as I can tell, he has never invented anything. I've heard the guy talk about science. He doesn't know anything that you couldn't get from watching the Discovery Channel. Moreover, it seems that his main business model is making ridiculously exaggerated claims about the state of technologies that they're working on, future technologies that they might develop, and the successive products they've released to draw in capital, and then trying to make up for those kind of overpromising and exaggerated claims by cutting safety, quality, and features while simultaneously squeezing workers every chance they get. This guy is literally, despite calling himself some sort of genius, he's only on, if I recall correctly, about 3 patents, and those are all with dozens of other people who are the actual scientific teams at his company. His biggest contribution was some slight modification to the shape of the door on one of the models of his car because he thought that it looked cool. On top of that, while Musk is publicly a big enemy of big government, that attitude changes when it comes to his own personal pocketbook. Musk's companies have gotten billions of dollars in state, local, and federal subsidies. An audit in New York showed that for every dollar in subsidies Tesla's factory in Buffalo received, the state only got 54 cents in economic benefit. His political influence is then further turned to get him exceptions for all sorts of environmental and pollution regulations. Musk, and men like him, proudly proclaimed a move fast and break things attitude, which is fine for him because it's usually other people's things he's breaking. When his companies lie about safety features and skimp out on adequate testing, it's other people that die so that he can raise more capital on those exaggerations. He forces workers to sleep in the office, fires them without adequate severance when they're no longer convenient, and that is the ones that survive. Constantly pushing for higher output from fewer people in less time, while cutting all kinds of safety measures and quality controls, has led to a rash of injuries and even deaths at his plants and factories. But Elon just keeps making money while their lives are ruined. You know, the unending greed of these people really stuns me. Can someone explain to me what it is that he wants that he can buy for $250 billion that he can't buy for $225 billion? What is it that these uber billionaires want so bad that they're willing to do anything to get richer still? Jeff Bezos is another guy I worry about. Was life really so bad with his hundreds of billions that he felt the need to force workers to piss in bottles? I really think that sometimes that even if they became trillionaires tomorrow, there would be nothing so evil that they wouldn't do it for $1 trillion and $1. Cannibalism, genocide, whatever, so long as they get a bit more, a bit more, a bit more. I think that this level of greed should be classified as psychosis. Nonetheless, there are some people who discount the idea of greedflation. One of these guys appeared as a guest on Tim Miller's podcast on The Bulwark, and the point he made was that greed couldn't be the cause of inflation because people have always been greedy. It's not like that suddenly changed. Well, of course that's true. Human nature didn't suddenly upend itself in the last few years. Of course people have always been greedy. The difference is a matter of power. The rules have been changed and set up now to favor those who are already at the top. With regulations loosened again and again, fewer and fewer companies are getting bigger and bigger, eating each other up to create monopolies or oligopolies in almost every industry. In 2019 to 20, 4 banks controlled 41% of U.S. assets. 4 meatpacking corporations controlled 85% of beef. 2 telecom companies controlled almost the entirety of internet access. 3 corporations made 3/4 of the beer we drink. 3 mobile phone companies control 80% of the market. 3 credit card companies control 95% of their market. Amazon alone controls 40% of online shopping, while Google holds a whopping 91.5% of searches worldwide. Pick an industry and you'll see a similar pattern. Fewer and fewer companies dominate the marketplace, which means they can basically set their terms. These companies are growing not just in market share, but in absolute size. the largest publicly traded company in 1996 had a market cap of 100 billion or so. Now the largest traded company in the world, Apple, is 20 times bigger at $2 trillion. At the same time, the number of publicly traded companies has fallen by about half in recent decades, from 8,000 in 1996 to a little over 4,000 today, which means more and more companies are in private hands with fewer regulations and less requirements about accounting and transparency, making it easier to hide things. And since these companies are privately rather than publicly owned, a smaller and smaller group of people end up controlling them all. While all these corporations have been growing in strength, workers have been growing weaker. In the 1950s, when inequality was at its lowest point and workers were making more than ever compared to their bosses, 1/3 of them were unionized. Today, it's around 10%. Without unions backing them up, and with money being allowed to flood into politics with the rise of lobbying in the late 70s, the corporocrats have managed to tilt the system in their favor in ways that we haven't seen in over a century. Greed can be kept in check, but when greed is given power, it takes over. That's why today the average billionaire pays a lower tax rate than the average teacher or construction worker. In the same year when I make 50,000, Elon makes 50 billion, and I'll probably end up paying a higher tax percentage anyway. I'm not kidding, by the way. The average billionaire is now paying a lower percentage of their taxes than the average worker. Meanwhile, an ever larger percentage of government revenue is coming not from income taxes, but from payroll and sales taxes. While income taxes are progressive, the richer pay more, sales and payroll taxes are regressive, meaning the richer you are, the less you pay. That's because payroll taxes cap out at $160,000, and poorer people spend a bigger chunk of their money on taxable products. Guys, this is why life is so damn hard for all of us. This is why our wages have been flat for over 40 years. Meanwhile, the things we need in our lives, like a home and education and healthcare, have increased in cost by 300 to 400% over the same time period, and that's after adjusting for inflation. We feel poor because a handful of the most wealthy, most powerful people in the country have taken literally everything. Everything! There's been a real change in the business culture over the last decades. As I look at things from the period between the end of World War II and the start of Reaganomics, I see a change in the culture. Businesses used to see themselves as part of the community and understood that they had other stakeholders besides just shareholders and executives. It was understood that if you take care of your workers, they take care of you. It was understood that the community was a valued partner for business, not a dumping ground for toxic waste. It was understood that competition and investing in research and development for the future were both important for overall growth and productivity. Basically, businesses understood that there was such a thing as the greater good, though admittedly that's because the law essentially forced them to act this way and the culture adapted to that. Unfortunately, once we entered the era of Reaganomics and greed is good ideology, the laws started to change. Once the laws changed and the people in charge saw what they could get away with, corporate executives learned that they could get more money more quickly if they extracted wealth and productivity from the economy rather than growing it. I think about all of the money that could have been spent on research and development, education, infrastructure, healthcare, things that would benefit all of us, that instead have gone to feed the vanity of a few. I wonder sometimes, even though the American economy is still the biggest in the world, just how much bigger and more vibrant our economy would now be if all that money that these billionaires had extracted had actually been invested productively. We're talking tens of trillions of dollars, the value of which would have compounded over time. We could have had high-speed rail or a more efficient, reliable electrical grid or free healthcare, all things that would benefit everyone and would provide value over time, eventually paying for themselves. Instead, we got 50 years with the average worker stuck in place. This is why when people my age hear stories of people who grew up 2 generations ago and how easy it was for them to afford a house and a car and retirement, we look at them like they're from another planet, because the fact is, they are. Those of us living and working today have gotten just absolutely screwed. Unfortunately, the very guys who have done the screwing have managed to convince about half of us that the real problem is some poor black woman who's already working 2 jobs to feed her kids because she's getting a couple bucks a month in food stamps. Leave aside the fact that money given to the poor actually grows the economy far more than money given to the rich, because they immediately spend it and create demand. What this poor hypothetical woman is getting is literally pennies compared to her boss's boss is getting in tax breaks and other handouts. If there was more competition in the economy and people like her were actually paid what they're worth, they wouldn't have to be on welfare. Unfortunately, our economy over the last 40 to 50 years has become so split between the rich and the rest that people struggle even when the economic data looks good. Highest wage growth in decades doesn't mean much when we're going up from zero. Highest GDP growth doesn't mean as much when the vast majority of that growth goes to a handful at the very top. Low unemployment isn't nearly as great as it sounds when those jobs don't pay enough for people to live. Now, I don't know if you guys remember, but I'd actually started this video talking about why Democrats are failing to talk about the economic situation properly. The economic data, which does look fairly good and frankly is good. Low unemployment with crap pay is definitely better than high unemployment with crap pay. But it doesn't convey the full economic picture of what's been happening over the last decades and how the consequences of Reaganomics have really started to squeeze people. While I'm on the topic of economic statistics, though, the economic readings are always better under Democrats. Whenever a Democratic administration comes in, often needing to clean up the damage left by the previous Republican, average unemployment gets lower, GDP growth goes higher, basically every economic statistic improves. But it's always a band-aid, a half measure. Democrats haven't been able to even come close to undoing all the damage that has been done by Reaganomics and trickle down over the last 2 generations. They need to think bigger and do more. But they can't do it alone. We, the people of America, the average working men and women, have to get up, get unified, and vote for people who are not going to sell us all out to their billionaire bosses. Republicans have been telling you for years that the people we should be worried about are those who don't look like you, don't sound like you, don't love like you, or pray like you. Republicans are telling you that your enemies are those who have nothing, and that the very fact that they have the audacity to be asked to be paid for their work what it's actually worth, or at least paid enough to survive, is some kind of audacity, that it's some kind of attack on you. This is just a lie, people. If you want to know the truth, follow the money. Our livelihoods and our futures are being stolen from us, from people who already have so much they literally don't know what to do with it, except to make yet more, and we have to stop it. Vote blue, people. Till next time.